Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, Canine Missing Project, a copyrighted edition for our video channel. And this is class number 2 in Bigfoot 101. Yes, we are going to talk about Bigfoot only in this video. So if you're expecting one of my videos about missing people, no. One of my news segments, no. It's going to be about Bigfoot. Now, before I get going too far, there's going to be a link right on the first comment, the pinned comment on this video. And on that link is going to be the way to get to this trailer, Missing 411, the UFO Connection. Our movie will be due out December 12th. And I can tell you it's going to be huge. I've got some inside scoop on what people are saying about it, and I'm blown away by what people are saying. So watch the trailer. If you can put that on your social media sites, I'd be very, very grateful. But getting on to where we left off with class number 1. And if you missed class number 1, go back, stop right now, go back and watch the first segment. And it's on the pinned comment of this video as well, and catch up. The response was huge. And I want you to understand that when I started this research, I didn't have a dog in the fight. It was methodical. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything along the way. And I wanted to make sure that it was just like an investigation I would do in the criminal world. But when I started, because I knew that there were various theories all over the map, I wanted to understand what the historical literature said before I stepped into the current day world. And that is important when you're dealing with something that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So last week I told you about this book, Bigfoot, Wild Men and Giants. You get it on our website. Our website, NA, like North America, NABigfootsearch.com. You can get this book. Now, all this book is articles from 1680 to 1923. Well, Dave, why did you stop at 1923? Because that's where the copyright cut off when I wrote the book. Now, it's a couple years since then, so I could write a new updated version and include more articles, and I will. But this one proved my point. Now, last week, I read some articles in there, and I was marching you closer to today's date. Well, we're going to start off, and I'm going to read you a few more articles, because I think they were important, and because people enjoyed them. It gives you an insight into what was going on. Now, this was in the Bristol News, Bristol, Tennessee, May 19th, 1871. A wild man in McNairy County, Tennessee. We learned that between Sabi and Cranesville, in what's called Piney and McNair County, a strange and frightful being has been observed for several weeks. He is said to be 7 feet high and possess the great muscular power. His eyes are unusually large and fiery red. His hair hangs in a tangled and matted mess of just below the waist, and his beard reaches below his middle. His entire body is covered with hair, and his whole aspect is most frightful. He shuns the sight of men, but approaches with wild and horrid screams to delight every woman who is unaccompanied by a man. He sometimes with great caution approaches houses, and should he see a man, he runs away with astonishing swiftness and leaping the tallest fences with the ease of a deer, defying alike the pursuit of men and dogs. He has frightened several women by attempting to carry them off, as well as by his horrid aspect, and whole country around Sabi is in consternation. The citizens are now scouring the woods and are determined either to capture or drive off the monster. A couple things about this. And when I read these things, I'm looking for information. In all of the articles, they talk about him running away with astonishing swiftness or frightful speed. defying the pursuit of men and dogs. Well, dogs can run a lot faster than men, and if this thing can outrun a dog, that's pretty unusual. So that was number one. This is from Melbourne, Australia. November 1876. Wild Man of the Woods. The Melbourne Crane correspondent for Sydney Evening News under the date 11th of November writes as follows. Who has not heard of the earliest settlement of the colony, the blacks speaking of some earthly animal or inhuman creature that inhabited some part of the wildest, inaccessible, rugged, and sequestered haunts namely the Yahoo Devil, or the Hairy Man of the Woods, which to this day they stand in fearful awe and terror. I, for one, sympathize with the superstitions and aboriginal sayings of those wild and unsophisticated denizens of the Australian bush, that their aboriginal tradition of such unearthly mongrels of monsters have and do exist, though so rare, and not as yet often seen or believed by the white men. 14 days ago, and not more than 10 miles from here towards the head of the Lachlan River, Uncoolumba Station, Hammonds, in one of the most secluded and melancholy-looking spots imaginable, imperceptibly a terror of awe creeps over everyone that have passed through this far and wide-known gorge of death chasm of the river. You with me? While a lad of the name Porter, a son of Porter, a settler on the Lachlan, was shepherding a flock of his father's sheep near the dismal rocky bridge or gorge of the so-called inhuman, unearthly-looking being was seen by the lad coming directly towards him from the high, rugged, and precipitous rocks. The Dobson, observing such of an unknown monster would not attack, became timid and crouched around the lad's legs, who became horror-struck with fear. He left the sheep to their fate and ran, together with his colleagues, for home. On relating the inhuman sight he had seen, which was not credited by his father or others at the time, they, however, at last mustered courage and went to the exact place described, but could find nothing and not seeing the hairy man. On Saturday last, however, a fishing party of young men and women went to the rocky bridge waterholes for a night's sport. The waterholes are famed far and near for quality and quantity of fish. It is customary for those on the sport to remain at that night, and as a matter of course, a large fire is made. On the evening of the memorable day, 2 hours before sundown, the young men and some of the women went to set their lines, leaving one of their friends to boil and billy and prepare supper. While engaged, the young woman was suddenly startled by observing a man, as she naturally imagined at first sight, one of their own party coming towards the fire, but upon walking closer discovered the appearance to be unsightly and inhuman, bearing in every which way the shape of a man with a big red face, hands and legs covered with long shaggy hair. From fright they became almost spellbound, screamed and screeched, but unable to run. Unable to run. Why? What happened? Something unusual happened? The men, on hearing the unearthly cries, left their fishing lines and ran with all speed towards the comrade. Upon reaching the fire, the monster on the alarm was only distant some 50 yards. On their appearing, it stood for a misyube or two, or turned away and made for the rocks. Two of the men armed themselves with a tomahawk and knife and followed this extraordinary phenomena of nature for a short distance up the rocky and ragged mountain, when suddenly it turned around and stood viewing the men as they were approaching. They also halted, being then about 60 yards from the object of their terror, and commanding a full view of the whole shape and make, resembling that of a big, slovenly man. The head was covered with dark grizzly hair, the face was shaggy darkish hair, the back and belly down the legs covered with hair of a lighter color. The devil, or whatever it may be called, doubled round and hurriedly made back towards the fire and women again. On seeing him coming, a fearful commotion amongst the females and a kind of supernatural terror among the men took place. In the meantime, before reaching the camp, it sighted towards the inaccessible Rocky Mount. The names of two of the men who witnessed and took part in the scene are Porter and Dunn, well-known settlers in the Abercrombie and Lachlan rivers. Mr. Lanier, another settler from the Lachlan, has informed the other day that the neighbors all around organized a party or two to go in search of the human monster and hunt him down, dead or alive. It is not many weeks ago that I recorded the remains of a similar animal or creature being found in the Walla Walla scrub. It is well known that old settlers for the last 30 years that the blacks will never camp within miles of the death-like chasm of the Lachlan, though they come distance every year to fish on the adjoining waterholes, but leave before sundown to camp miles away. Whether this be black's veritable Yahoo devil or the white man's hairy man of the woods, time it is hoped will now shortly tell. I read that and I said, oh, wow. 1876. That is a pretty darn good description from 4 or 5 people who saw this. Now, the biped didn't attack anybody. Seemed to be mostly interested. And the people were frightened just by his appearance, not by his actions. I thought it was fascinating. I think it's really interesting that Australia at the time was having these reports as well as the US. So this is in the Vancouver Independent, November 25th, 1876. On Saturday, the 4th of November, while I was rowing a boat up Woodward's Bay, which is a branch of South Bay, I saw something was moving in the grass on the beach. Its back, covered with light hair about 1.5 inches long, was in sight. I thought it was a fox or a coon. The tide was high, and I turned my boat toward the bank. As I neared the shore and laid down one oar, preparatory to striking the animal with the other, it stood erect just like a man and looked at me a moment over its shoulder. I was surprised and dropped my oar in amazement. The body was covered with light brown hair, while longer and lighter tresses hung heavily from its head. Its arms were small, tower limbs long and muscular, stood about 3 feet high and face like a child's, with piercing light blue eyes. It sprang into the bush, jumped over a log, and hid. I found it and stood within a few feet of it, wondering how to make its capture without turning its eyes from me. The strange creature laid under the log until my hands were within a few inches of its body. Then it passed under the tree and ran away with such speed that I could not keep it in view. I am sure that it is a white person, young or old, and while its visage is impressed upon my memory, I shall never, ever, never believe that this thing did exist. Indians report that 5 years ago they saw an object which answers to the above description. It scared them off the spit. They report that it was seen by as long as 2 years ago. Fascinating about this. Blue eyes, hair all over the body. Said it looked like a white child. Remember these descriptions, folks. We study history for a reason. If everyone says it looks one way, and then suddenly it starts to change when certain researchers come into the field, you gotta ask yourself, why? 1878, a wild man in Nebraska. The Freeman, Nebraska Tribune contains an article about the details of a discovery of a wild man in the vicinity. It's always wild man, not animal, not ape, not gorilla, wild man. 2 young men were out hunting waterfowls when they came upon the strange being. He was just emerging from a clump of trees and underbrush when they caught a glimpse of him. His dress was in the most primitive style, consisting of a woolen shirt. He had a stick in his hand, which he swung around his head as striking something he saw in the air, and uttering while a warp, unearthly noise. Like a wild animal, he was constantly on a sharp lookout, nervously looking this way and that, as his ear detected an unusual noise, or his eye noticed the shaking of a reed or anything that was the least extraordinary. After a few moments, he squatted on his haunches under a tree and began to dig in the ground with his hands and stick, occasionally carrying something in his mouth which he deemed to be eating. The boys became more interested in the strange being than the object of their hunt, and crawled cautiously toward it until near enough to satisfy their curiosity. He was digging roots and feeding upon them. As nearly as they could judge from appearances, he was about 40 to 45 years of age, of strong and bony frame, his hair so long as to fall in curls upon his bronzed and dirty shoulders, his beard, like his hair, long and shaggy, and his entire body covered in a growth of hair which could not have been less than an inch long. His complexion must have been originally light, as his hair was a light brown. After viewing him a short time, they concluded to retreat. After going a few steps toward the monster, sprung up and stared intently at them, becoming frightened, and sprang into the Platte River, crossing over the little island and disappeared into the thick underbrush. You normally don't think of Bigfoots in Nebraska, but I have a good friend named Jaryd that has a Bigfoot shop in Nebraska. She says, "Oh yes, Dave, they are here." And as of 1878, they were there. This is in Scotland. Discovery of the veritable wild man of the woods. An Armenian newspaper, the Nishak, published at Tiflis, recounts a discovery in the neighboring forests of a veritable wild man of the woods, a human being speaking no language, completely naked, but with body, limbs, and face covered with hair. His nationality is unknown, and he seems incapable of uttering articulate sounds. It is likely to remain so. An attempt to clothe him met with no success, and he tore the things off of him with savage energy. Stevia, not a paid endorsement. I bought this stevia. 0 sugar, much healthier for you. Stevia is a natural ingredient. It is a plant. It's much stronger sweetener than sugar. It takes a while to get used to it, but it's good. So, the clothing part of Bigfoot. Lots of stories out there from hundreds of years ago that they used to wear clothing. Not too many stories these days about that. Not too many stories out there about a female Bigfoot, but there are those there. This is one. Boston Weekly, February 28th, 1882. A female covered with hair running untamed in the woods at Stamford, Vermont. Bennington, Vermont, February 25th. A Frenchman who recently visited a place called the Bear Swamp near Stamford, Vermont on a hunting excursion relates the story and furnishes partial proof of the statement in the scars which his physiognomy bears. After traveling about the woods in the vicinity of the Bear Swamp with varying success for about a half an hour, he was startled by a sudden noise in the thicket nearby, and at once put his gun to his shoulder. Couple things. Bigfoot, swamps, Bigfoot, water. Pay attention to that. I started paying attention to this years ago. A lot of people discount it. Rob Alley, famous Bigfoot researcher, one of the smartest men in the field, wrote a book about Bigfoot in Alaska. And there have been hundreds of sightings of Bigfoot in the channels and things in Alaska, swimming between islands and such. And he wrote about it. Great book. And Bigfoot likes water. It likes to conceal itself in water, and it likes using it as its own personal highway. And it understands that people don't like to move through swamps, so it'll go into a swamp to disappear. Put its gun to his shoulder. He's seeing a strange apparition, which at first sight he imagined was a bear. He started to run for a tree. A wild, maniacal laugh followed him, and the black, hairy creature disappeared, walking as the opponent thought on its hind legs. The noise emitted from the creature's lungs led the hunter to believe that it was something other than a bear, and mustering as much temerity as his frightened condition would allow, he started to investigate. He had proceeded but a short distance into the depths of the brush and undergrowth when he caught sight of the black figure leaning over a spring, drinking, its back towards the hunter. The time had arrived for action, and throwing down his gun, the hunter rushed to the creature, clasping its arms around what proved to be the waist of a woman, nude except for a heavy undergrowth of black hair that covered every portion of her body except a part of her breast. The hug was but temporary, however, and for turning upon him, the strange creature pierced and tore the inquisitive hunter's face till he was glad to let go and run for his life. The crazy, sepulchral laugh followed him, however, and the hunter will avoid in the future this to him decidedly unpleasant locality. So yes, there are females. Yes, they are scattered across the world. This was in 1882. You with me still? Now, this was in the Farmer and Mechanic in Raleigh, North Carolina, 1883. The title of the article is Beast or Human Being. A wild woman, or perhaps the mate of a gorilla, recently captured has appeared near Lafayette, Indiana, and is terrorizing the people. Mrs. Frank Kaufman, the wife of a well-known farmer, saw it the other day and thus describes it. Mrs. Kaufman was passing through the timber when she suddenly saw to her right a hideous creature formed like a woman, with long black hair flowing in the wind and the whole body covered with short gray hair. The creature was breaking twigs from a sassafras bush and eating the bark. The noise made in breaking the bush prevented it hearing Mrs. Kaufman's approach. Frozen with horror, the farmer's wife stood and gazed on the remarkable creature before her. Suddenly, the wild woman turned and, facing her civilized sister, glaring at her with a bale light of hate. Raising her long, hairy arm, she gave an unearthly shriek and darted away into the forest. And almost paralyzed with fear, Mrs. Kaufman gazed after the wild creature for a moment. Then, with agonized screams, she fired homeward. Her cries of fear attracted her husband, who was at work in the field, and he hastened toward her, reaching her side as her knees gave way with weakness, resulting from mortal terror. He carried his wife to the house, gave the alarm, and soon 100 men and boys, accompanied by dogs, were on the trail of the wild woman. She was hotly pursued and several times came near being caught, but eluded her pursuers with wonderful skill and cunning. For fully a half a mile of the chase, she was never out of sight. Her feet touched the ground, but seldom. Key point. For people to be chasing something and for them to say she was so fast, and we don't even think her feet touched the ground, remember this. This is another key point. When people describe a Bigfoot, sometimes they describe it as though the head never moves. When you and I run, our head goes like this, the top of our head as we run. Bigfoot head stays. And it's been said that it's almost as though it's moving, but it's not touching the ground. And this is an article in 1883 that says essentially the same thing. She would grab the underbrush with her long, bony hands and swing from bush to bush and limb to limb with wonderful ease. She seemed only endeavoring to keep just beyond her pursuers until coming to the swamp, and she disappeared as suddenly and effectively as an extinguished light, and no searching could find her whereabouts. Okay. Water. Swamps. Many Native Americans have told me that Bigfoot likes to stay in water. Not sure what that means. I've also been told by several tribes that they like pristinely clean water to drink. So sometimes you'll find evidence of them near springs. So that's as far as we'll go today on the historical part of it. But remember, as I'm reading this stuff, I'm getting more and more convinced that we're dealing with something with human origins. They all say it looks like a human, it runs like a human, runs upright, doesn't run bent over. It's obviously very smart. It isn't caught. And as is described in that last article, it stayed just ahead of the people and then disappeared when it wanted to. Now, part of that research at this point is I'm also reading things from people who are doing the research now. Grover Krantz was a famous researcher out of British Columbia. And he was a biologist who believed, as does Jeff Meldrum, a current researcher today, that Bigfoot is a Gigantopithecus. So, this is a famous frame out of the Patterson-Gimlin film. This is very, very famous. It turns, it looks. This is in Bluff Creek. The area where this happened doesn't look anything like this today. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, let's think about simplistic terms. What you do is you have a biped moving upright, not bent over. It's moving upright and stands upright like a human. Its arms swing large, and it's covered in hair. And its head's covered in hair. So the simplistic way of looking at it is that, oh my, we're dealing with an ape or a gorilla. Friends, that is really, really simple. Really a simplistic way to look at this. You got to be smarter than that. So, this film is owned by Mrs. Patterson today. Well, I was a young buck at the time, and I said, why hasn't anybody talked to Mrs. Patterson? So it's 15 years ago now. So I was a licensed private investigator. I was a former police officer. I just looked up her name in Washington and drove up there. You could not have found a nicer lady. She invited me into her house. We sat down for the entire day. And I explained to Mrs. Patterson that that one frame, or the several frames out of that film, would be very valuable to me as a researcher if we could take them to a copy store and scan them at ultra high resolution so we could have a copy of it and blow this up. She goes, sure, Dave. Can I go with you to make sure it doesn't leave my custody? I go, absolutely. So I drove her down to a store, and the slow scan of this took hours. Mrs. Patterson sat there the entire time. She was more than helpful. She talked about her husband, Roger. Roger was the one who actually took the 16 millimeter film of the biped at Bluff Creek. She explained that Roger never changed his story, that this is what they found. She said her husband would never, ever have hoaxed it. She said on his deathbed, he said that this was the greatest discovery that he had ever made. And I'll always remember that day. One of the nicest ladies I've ever met. Now, what came out of that? First of all, there were several frames where the biped is running, walking very fast, and turns. So as it turns, the film is still running. This is an enlarged version of one of those frames. I want you to pay real close attention and look at the top of the head and down the middle of the back. This is super important, folks. Super important, and something that is completely discounted by everyone who thinks it's an ape. Down the middle of the back. First of all, you see at the top of the head, there's a little bulge up there. And then down the middle of the back, right here, if you look just slightly down that bulge, there's a slight indentation right there. So You have the head, then you have a bulge down the other side, and then down the middle of the back, it's a ponytail. And there's a little tie right here that appears to hold that hair together. Head, bulge, tie, ponytail. The first time this was shown to me, after I gave a researcher my slides, he called me up and he said, "Dave, you're not going to believe this." And then what he did is he took one of the frames, he made it into black and white, and he said, "Dave, look at this. Here's a better picture of it. Ponytail, there's the little tie, and there's the bulge where the hair was pulled together on the top of the head and went down the back." Why is this important? Intelligence. No, an ape or a gorilla would not have a ponytail. No. Showing intelligence is something that goes against what they want you to believe is a Gigantopithecus. This is scary, folks, how much you have been lied to over the years. The people that have the most notoriety in this world of Bigfoot are the ones who have the most education. So they want you to think it's Gigantopithecus, a giant ape. It's a giant extinct ape that lived from 2 million to 350,000 years ago. There's been no Gigantopithecus for 350,000 years. I'm just going to tell you the facts from here down. Hold on. Their evidence of existence was found in 1935 when 2 molar teeth were found in China. And in 1956, they found a mandible. Now, since then, they found about 1,000 teeth and 4 mandible. They did DNA, and they found that it was closely tied to the orangutan. Based on the size of the mandible and the teeth, they said that it was at 440 to 660 pounds. And based on the teeth and the area that it was in, which was a very jungly type area, they said it was an herbivore. And they said it was 25% larger than a gorilla. This was only found in China, all of the teeth, the mandibles. And the classification was Aponginae. The youngest specimen was 350 to 380,000 years old. They're pushing the agenda that this is an extinct Gigantopithecus. So, they found evidence of this in China. Never outside of China. It's been extinct for 350,000 years. Nobody says that Giganto ever stood upright. It bent, hunched over like an ape. It was an herbivore. Bigfoot's an omnivore. And you can say with almost 100% certainty, apes almost never swim. It's very, very, very rare. But Rob Alley had hundreds of stories of Bigfoot swimming in Alaska. There's not one shred of any evidence it was ever in North America. Every animal that you could name can be trapped and photographed. Bigfoot's never been trapped. Arguably, it can never be photographed in a controlled setting. It never has been in a controlled setting. So to think that Bigfoot is a Gigantopithecus is an insult to your intelligence. And the people that are pushing that agenda believe you are stupid enough to believe it. And that is fact. So, I've given you some pretty good information about Giganto now, and your mind should be racing. So, when they were doing the Patterson-Gimlin film, the History Channel went out and they took the stride. You can look at the Patterson-Gimlin film online on YouTube. Look up Patterson-Gimlin stabilized version, and you can see, because when Roger Patterson took the footage, it wasn't on a tripod, he was bouncing all over, but there's a stabilized version. You can see how the stride of this is much different than in anything you know of. They tried to get a human athlete to walk in the same manner that this biped did. They couldn't do it. They could not do it. So that's number one. Number two, this version does not have it because it's more on the front of the leg. It's on the right leg. But on the front of the right thigh, there's a giant herniation or wound. And it is huge. And you can see that it appears that that is a serious injury. But as this biped moves along, there is no noticeable limp. But as it does move, you can see the muscles in its buttocks and in its back move as its hands, arms, and legs swing. And in fact, in one of the frames, the creature, I will say the biped, picks its back foot up so its back foot is almost flush straight up 90 degrees from the ground. And you could see how flat of a foot it has. Now in this photo, the biped turns and looks directly at the photographer, Roger Patterson. So as it's looking at Roger, its mouth, it appears, has teeth that are odd, meaning distorted. And you couple that with its facial construction. And at the time I said, Harvey, I'm talking to Harvey Pratt, the forensic artist that I employed to do this work. And I said, Harvey, what we need to do is we need to have you take that picture and take all the hair off of its face. And let's see what it looks like without its hair. And why is that important? Because I want to know what it looks like. Does it look like an ape or a gorilla? Does it look like a human? So, a man named Doug Hychek was the executive producer of a series called Monster Quest. One of the best shows, I think, ever on History Channel. Doug's a great guy. We've worked together on projects before. Super smart. And he knows what time it is. So I gave Harvey the picture, the close-up picture, and I said, Harvey, can you take this? And he goes, oh yeah, I can take the hair off that easy. And I called Doug Hychek, that's Harvey's doing the work. And I said, hey Doug, did you ever take the hair off the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot face? He goes, oh yeah. I go, what did it look like? He goes, oh, it looked like human. I go, why didn't you ever put it in your series? Because that wasn't our hypothesis. We're always working off the Jeff Meldrum hypothesis that it was an ape or a gorilla. I said, what? You didn't lay all the evidence in front of the people? Oh no, no. We didn't do that. It didn't work towards our best interests, so we didn't do it. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So I didn't know what was going to happen with Harvey, but I want you to understand something. Why did I pick Harvey Pratt? Because he was the best forensic artist I could find anywhere in the world. Now this is a picture that Harvey had. No, I'm sorry. This is a picture of a suspect that Harvey had in a kidnapping when he worked for the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. He didn't have this picture at the time, but this is the picture of the suspect. What he did have is he had witnesses who saw that suspect, and Harvey sat down with the witnesses and did that drawing. And he didn't have any idea what the suspect looked like other than the verbal description from the witnesses. And that is what the suspect looked like. It almost looks as though Harvey had the suspect sitting in the room when he did the drawing. Is there any question in your mind that what Harvey Pratt draws is in reality what people see? Not at all. He's the best in the world. So, I get Harvey Pratt involved. And he heard stories his whole life from where he lived in Oklahoma about Bigfoot. So as I'm walking down this path of trying to understand ape, gorilla, human, what am I dealing with? In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, if it's a gorilla, why hasn't anybody trapped one? Bait them, trap them, photograph them. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking stupid. Okay. At the same time, I'm accumulating reports, sighting reports from all over Northern California. And I have this giant map on my wall in my office. But what we did is we took that map and we had sightings on the map from probably 12 different sources. Hundreds of sightings, but 12 predominant sources of where the information came from. And what I did is I put numbers on the map to correspond to a narrative about what happened. As an example, one was Mount Shasta, 1850. Miner observes a huge hairy creature walking on 2 feet, break a sluiceway against a tree, elevation 4,000 feet, and I put the source. So what I've done is I list all of the sightings on the back side of the map. This is the map that we produce. I took that map and I said, well, I used it for 10 years, so I'll start selling it. So if people want to take our work and go out and look and see where all the sightings are in Northern California, it's right here. Bigfoot Sightings Map. And then the 350 locations identified, the most comprehensive map ever made of Bigfoot sightings in Del Norte, Humboldt, Trinity, Siskiyou counties. Partial map of Tehama, Mendocino, and Shasta counties in California, and Curry and Jackson counties in Oregon. Now what I did is I went to California AAA. I was living in the Bay Area, and that was their headquarters at the time. And I went in and met with their cartographers. And I explained to them what I was doing. And one of those guys he goes, oh God, Dave, that's great. So what do you want to do? I go, I want to license the map from you. He goes, sure. He goes, we do that all the time. This would be great. And he goes, let me just make sure it's okay with the powers to be. About a week later, he comes back and he says, oh yeah, they were all up for it. So the map we used in here is a AAA driving map, just with sightings put on it, licensed by the California State AAA. And you may ask, well, Dave, why are you doing a map? Okay, good question. Maps are important for a multitude of reasons. When I was a police officer, we used maps all the time to track where serial criminals hit. And we knew that based on where they hit, when they hit, we could predict where they'd hit next time. And we could also predict where they probably lived based on where they did their crimes. To me, whether it's Missing People, my Missing 411 series, or whether it's Bigfoot series, it's important to see chronologically where these sightings took place. The circumstances to the sighting, and what we could say about what may happen in the future. Now, if there's been one location that had sightings for 100 years, well, that might be a pretty good place to go start your research. If there was one location where sightings stopped 50 years ago, maybe not so good. But if you could see the sightings progress, say, up along a coast to a certain location, well, that might be interesting. And then we started to find things that there was a group of islands off the coast of Northern California where the people that lived on the cliffs would see the Bigfoot swim to the islands. And they figured out that the Bigfoot swam to those islands at a certain part of the year to take and eat the bird eggs that were there and hatching. It was fascinating. Again, another indicator it was not an ape or a gorilla because of the swimming ability it showed. And it showed phenomenal ability because in Alaska and off the coast of California, the water there is very cold. Too cold for us to swim in at any period of time without a wetsuit. Yeah. So you get all of these markers. And then I started to go out and I started to interview these people, like the people that saw the Bigfoot swimming in the water to these islands. I went to a house of a logger. And he said that he was one of the first to go out, and when a tree was down, he would go out and start cutting the branches off the tree to drag them down the mountain. And he says that he was by himself in this area, and a tree went down, and all of a sudden this Bigfoot appeared running at tremendous speed and appeared to be faster than anything he'd ever seen. It was almost like a blur. And one of the things I asked him, I said, well, did it come from the top of the tree you just fell? And he said, well, that's kind of what I thought. Well, that's fascinating. Because I also had a report when I was doing the research up around Northern California, and there was a big redwood trees there, that I had several people tell me that the Bigfoot would shimmy up the redwood trees. They would put the arms around it and pull themselves up the redwood tree. If you ever get near a redwood tree, and I hope you do sometime because they're gorgeous living things. But if you look at the top of a redwood tree, there's like a canopy all the way around up there. You can't see past a certain spot, way up top. I had several people tell me that the Bigfoot lived in the canopy of the redwood trees. And in fact, one person took me to a tree and said, this is the tree that they seem to go up the most. And when I looked at that tree and I compared it to the other redwood trees, there was a fascinating thing. The bark on that tree was almost smooth all the way up, where the bark on the other trees was still rough and coarse. Now, redwood tree bark is very deep, where you and I could almost put your hand around a piece of the bark and go in several inches and grab the bark and shimmy your way up. Redwood trees are fascinating. And when I heard the story from the logger, and then I heard the story from this other person, I thought, could be something to this. So I'm gathering the stories on the map. I'm taking the map and I'm looking at locations in Northern California. Now, one other thing I was doing is probably the best researcher for his time in the world was a man named John Green out of British Columbia. John produced a series of books called On the Track of Sasquatch. He wrote them in 1980. I have copies of the books. I have original copies of the books. And in those books, like in the contents, it would say, Meet the Sasquatch, the Ruby Creek incident, the William Rowe and Albert Osman incident, the Sasquatch caught, apes in the islands, the quiet years, Ape Canyon, something on the road. So I read the Albert Osman incident. It's a story of a man camped by himself deep in the woods of British Columbia. He knew something came to visit him at night, but he didn't know what. Well, one night, a Bigfoot just grabs this little sleeping bag, while he's in the sleeping bag, just throws it over his shoulder. Albert's trapped in the sleeping bag, and this Bigfoot walks for a couple hours back to its home, which is in this rocky cave area, as it was described. Now, the story describes an incident where Albert's held against his will, he thought, in this cave. This was years before anybody ever thought these things existed. And this is way in the middle of nowhere, British Columbia. The story is important, and I encourage you between now and the next class to look up the Albert Osman incident. Other parts of this story were Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, apes in the islands. Now, Mr. Green held this belief that they were apes, and he was one of the people that pushed it very hard. Blue Creek Mountain, Roger Patterson's movie, Where Are the Bones? Some of the parts that make the book what it is. But one of the things that really struck me when I started to read this were the stories they were told almost had human-like qualities to what they described. And I wasn't looking for that. I'm thinking, well, Mr. Green knows much more about this than anybody at the time, and he's saying it's an ape, it must be an ape. But then I'm listening to the words that people describe, and they don't quite describe that. This is book number 2, On the Track of Sasquatch. Again, John Green. He owned a newspaper in British Columbia. What this said was screams in the night, tracks in the snow, flurries of action, and gentle giants. Gentle giants. Giants from the past. And I'm thinking, that's pretty fascinating. Giants. So at the time, I was doing research on Bigfoot, and I was doing research on missing people loosely. And that's how I came up with this book. I just started cutting out articles and copying articles from archives of where I was at about those topics. And what I quickly realized is that Bigfoot was described as a giant many times. Well, why not include stories of giants in the book? Because that might be important. Because there has never been an ape or a gorilla found in Northern California, or North America rather, but there have been many stories of giant bones found in North America. Well, Dave, how can that be? Well, therein lies the argument that a lot of people have a tough time with. So the people still pushing the ape or gorilla agenda, how do they slough off that there are giants in North America? And Bigfoot was described as a giant. A lot of stories out of British Columbia where the Bigfoot were said to go into fishing camps and steal fish. Okay, I can understand that. So, as I'm accumulating my data, formulating my thoughts, doing my map, this was way before I ever go in the field and do any ground pounding, I started to talk to other researchers. And I just started to be fat, dumb, and happy and walk into a Bigfoot store and just start talking to people. And I started asking them the tough questions, same ones I'm preparing to talk to you about. You know, a lot of people say that it's really smart, it's never been captured in recent times, and some articles even say it has a language. Well, animals don't have a language. They said different tribes say they've traded with them. Well, animals don't trade. Yeah, we don't like to talk about that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't fit the hypothesis that's out there that it's an ape or a gorilla. Yeah, but how can you discount the fact that tribes in the Northwest have been doing this for hundreds of years? Yeah, we just don't talk about that. So if you watch a lot of Bigfoot shows, they either will not say or they discount or dismiss what Native Americans say about this being a different type of tribe. They won't do it. They won't say that there's evidence that these tribes traded with them. They won't do it. They want to make you believe that it's a stupid ape or a gorilla. And if it's so stupid, then how come we as humans can't lure it in with some bait? If it's so stupid, then why can't we photograph it at will? The questions that they will not ask on a TV show. And they want to look as though they're so pristinely smart in the way they do things. But the reality is, all of these shows, they walk around in the dark, not knowing what they're doing. What's the goal of the episode? They won't ever say, because they don't have any idea. In some shows, they do the same thing every night. Are they trying to get just a glimpse of the biped on film for you? Is that really all they're trying to do? If that's it, how's that going to prove anything? Because let me tell you something, folks. During my time producing now 3 documentaries, I've met some people in the production world that do special effects. They can make anything they want in special effects and fool you. A lot of you have sent me footage and said, well, Dave, this is really great Bigfoot footage. I looked at it and I said, I didn't want to insult anybody, but I just didn't respond. And I'd say, that's special effects. I met some 13 and 14-year-olds that can do special effects that will blow your mind. And they do it for fun, just to blow your mind and put it up and hoax it. So why is the Patterson-Gimlin film that important? Because that was way before anything could be hoaxed or anything could be faked at that high a level. Now, Mr. Green in British Columbia took that Roger Patterson film to Disney Studios in Los Angeles after it came out and showed it to him. And the production crew at Disney said, there is no way we could fake that. That's real. We don't have costumes good enough that could do that. And it would be pure stupidity to build a costume in the presence or in the frame of a woman. Why not just do it as a man? Because the breasts we couldn't never make them look normal. But the Patterson-Gimlin film was of a female. So, another data point. The Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed in 16 millimeter. Now we have digital that can fake anything. Anything you watch on YouTube, easily faked. Easily. Now, the only other piece of footage out there that I've seen that I would say is also real is the Paul Freeman footage from Washington State. There's a lot of people out there in the world that like to slam others, slam me, make fun of others, make fun of me, when they've never done anything in their life. Paul Freeman worked on watershed property in Washington, where there was no people allowed. He was like their ranger. And one day out there, he caught a glimpse of a Bigfoot. And he decided to make it his life to get it on film. And he got some really good footage of it. And he got some really good tracks of a small one and a big one. Is Freeman's footage real? Oh yeah. Look at it. It's on YouTube. Paul Freeman. It's not, you don't get to see the face as good as you do with the Patterson-Gimlin footage, but you get to see it, and it's good. And it will make you think about what is really out there in our world. So, kind of took you up to date here. I talked to you about John Green's books and how he thought it was an ape or a gorilla. Talked to you about Harvey Pratt and Harvey's ability to put pen to paper and bring something to life. And I talked to you about Patterson-Gimlin footage and the Patterson-Gimlin biped with the ponytail. Now, why do they want it to have what's called a sagittal crest, or that big bump on its head like that? Is because apes and gorillas have that. So for them to admit, oh, that's not something in their cranium, that's a ponytail, that blows their theory to water. Folks, it's a ponytail. And this is the other photo I showed you that showed that ponytail a little bit better. It's just changing the colors so you could see it better. That's it. Then I told you of our map. The map is important. Why go to an area and look for quartz if you're in an area that's nothing but lava? You want to go where the things are living. And lastly, giants are important. Giants relate to Bigfoot in old historical text and in text today. All right? Next week, we're going to delve deeper into what I found out at Hoopa, California, Northern California, in my 2 years there, and how Harvey and I worked together to expose that, with the aid and the assistance of the elders in that community. This is huge. The last thing I want to leave you with. There's a lot of people out there in this world that call themselves researchers. Well, what does that really mean? Are they researchers or are they weekend hobbyists? Have they ever written a book about their work? Have they ever contributed to a study? Have they ever done DNA work? Have they ever put up traps to catch hair or fiber? In short, folks, 95% to 99% of everyone out there in the Bigfoot world that calls himself a researcher, they've never done any research. None. They've read a lot of books, maybe, but that's not research. When you watch the people on TV, the vast majority of them have never done any research. They're talking heads that have an opinion, that are willing to go on a TV show and say anything that the producers want them to say. That's really what it amounts to. So be very careful what you believe and where you're led with that thinking that you watch. I'm greatly humbled you're here. Remember, Missing 411, the UFO Connection. Watch the trailer. Spread it around your social media. We're walking this path together. And I've got a lot more on this to come. And that is it for Classroom Session 2, Bigfoot 101. Paulides out.